The petition arrived at 400 station time, which meant nobody important was awake to receive it. That job fell to me. I was on my third coffee, sitting in the docking control office with my boots off and a cold sandwich on the desk, when the proximity alert lit up the entire board. Not one ship, not two. 14 vessels dropped out of transit within the same 60-second window, which was either an invasion or a statement. The formation told me everything. They were flying in a spiral pattern, each ship slightly behind and above the one ahead, like a coiled ribbon of light. No species flies that way, unless they want to look harmless and impressive at the same time. I put my boots back on. By the time I reached the main receiving bay, my communications officer, a young man named Owen Price, had already opened a translation channel. He looked at me the way junior officers look at you when something large and strange has appeared, and they have done everything correctly and now want someone else to be in charge of what happens next. I took the channel. The voice that came through was layered, like three people speaking with one intention. It identified itself as the combined diplomatic voice of the Galactic Coalition, representing 7 sovereign species, and it said that the matter was urgent, that lives beyond counting were at stake, and that they had come to Earth because Earth was the last option they had not yet exhausted. I told them to dock at Bay 7 and bring no more than 8 representatives aboard. Owen looked at me. I looked at my sandwich. I picked it up and took a bite. The 8 representatives who walked off that ramp were the most visually dramatic collection of living creatures I had ever seen in one corridor. There was a Theresi, which looked like a cathedral made of glass and slow decisions, its body cycling through deep blue and violet light in patterns I had not yet learned to read. There were 2 Selhari, tall and silver-furred with eyes that moved independently like they were watching 2 different futures. A Gren delegate, squat and bark-skinned, who walked with the particular dignity of a species that has survived 3 extinction events and is tired of people being surprised about it. 3 others I had no name for yet. And at the front, a Ven named Counselor Adiz, which was notable because the Ven had been refusing diplomatic contact with Earth for 11 years over a trade disagreement involving mineral rights on a moon nobody cared about anymore. The fact that she was here meant things were very bad. She placed a data tablet on the table in the receiving room before she sat down. 412 pages. I could see the length of the index from where I stood. I sat across from her. I read the executive summary. I read the threat matrix. I read the projected loss figures, which were presented in both Venn numerical notation and standard human format, probably because someone on their team understood that humans respond differently to numbers they can immediately picture. 43 inhabited systems. 9 species with confirmed population losses above 60%. 3 species with no confirmed survivors from their home worlds. The Voakai hegemony, expanding along the outer arm of the galaxy in a pattern that looked, on the star map, less like conquest and more like digestion. I flipped to the military assessment section. The Coalition had tried. 7 combined fleets over 4 engagements. The Voakai did not have better weapons, exactly. They had a better understanding of cost. Every time the Coalition forces took damage, they recalculated. Every time the recalculation said the loss was no longer acceptable, they withdrew. The Voakai knew this. They planned around it. They applied pressure at exactly the rate that kept the mathematics of engagement tipping against any reasonable defender. It was not evil. It was, in its own way, almost elegant. I set the tablet face down. Counselor Adiz said that humanity had a reputation. That reputation had crossed species lines and political disagreements, and even, apparently, 11 years of mineral rights disputes. She said that humanity was known in the outer Coalition worlds as the species that does not recalculate, the species that finds a way to make the mathematics irrelevant. She said that 3 of the 7 species at this table had populations still alive, because Earth had been doing things in the last 30 years that most of the galaxy considered either brave or irrational, and that the distinction had stopped mattering. She asked if humanity would help. I looked at the table. I looked at the Theresi, who had shifted into a deep, bruised violet that I had not seen before but understood perfectly. I looked at the star map still glowing on my tablet through the back of the cover. I thought about a colony called Kepler Station. I thought about a Senate vote. I thought about what it feels like to hold a petition while something burns. I said I would pass the request to the appropriate authority. She said they had already contacted every appropriate authority for 6 months. Committees, councils, assemblies, reviews. She said they had not come to Earth at 400 station time to speak to another committee. The Theresi envoy, who had not spoken until this moment, said, in a voice like wind through hollow stone, that they had been told humans understand urgency. I looked at the 412-page document. I looked at the star map. I said, we understand it fine. You're just going to hate how we respond to it. I made one call, not to a committee, not to a council. One call to Admiral Grace Ackafer, who picked up on the second ring despite the hour, which told me she had been awake and waiting, which told me she already knew everything in that tablet and had been waiting for the question to become official. She asked me what I thought. I told her the threat was real. The coalition was genuinely exhausted, and the Volkai were doing something that a sufficiently committed opposing force could interrupt if that force was willing to absorb costs that the Volkai had never encountered before. She asked me what I needed. I told her one ship. There was a silence on the line, not the silence of disagreement, the silence of a person who has already done the math and is waiting to see if you have done it too. She said, which one? I said, threshold. Another silence, shorter. She said, done. I went back to the receiving room. All 8 delegates were still there, which told me they had nowhere else to go. The Theresi was cycling violet so deep it was almost black. I told them Earth was responding. Councillor Adiz asked how many ships. She had the tone of someone bracing for a number. Her hands were flat on the table. She was ready to negotiate, to argue, to accept less than she hoped for and call it enough. I told her one. The room did not react immediately. That is the thing about delivering genuinely unexpected information. There is always a delay while the brain tries to find a category for it. Then the Selhari delegate made a sound like tearing paper. The Gren went very still. The Theresi stopped cycling entirely, which I later learned was the Theresi equivalent of losing the ability to speak. Councillor Adiz said very carefully, one ship. One ship, I said. She asked if that was a preliminary deployment, an advanced scout, a gesture of intent before the full force mobilized. I told her it was none of those things. She asked what it was then. I picked up my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. An answer, I said. The silence that followed lasted 41 seconds. I know because Owen timed it later, when I asked him why his incident report was longer than usual. He said he had needed to document something that did not fit into any existing form category, so he had written it out in full. He titled his entry, First Contact with the Concept of Enough. I thought that was a little dramatic, but I kept it in the file. The UNWS Threshold was not the largest ship in Earth's fleet. That distinction belonged to the carrier Resolute, which was essentially a city that had decided to go places. The Threshold was not the most heavily armed. That was the Meridian, which had weapons systems that required a separate moral review board before every deployment, which I always thought said something interesting about the people who built it. The Threshold was, by most measurable categories, a mid-weight tactical warship, 1,400 meters bow to stern, 82 weapon systems, ranging from close defense point batteries to long-range mass drivers, 847 crew, a hull that had taken 3 major hits in its operational lifetime and come back from all 3, which meant the engineers were either very good or the ship was developing opinions. I had served on her twice before this deployment. I knew her the way you know a person you have been through something real with, not fondly, not romantically, just accurately. Siveth, the Thuresi envoy assigned to observe the mission, met me at the airlock on embarkation morning. He had been given the liaison role because he was, by Thuresi standards, calm. I had been told this by 3 separate coalition officials, all of whom used the word calm with the specific emphasis that suggested they were describing someone who had survived things that made calm a deliberate practice rather than a natural state. He was cycling a slow, steady amber when I found him. He looked at the threshold the way you look at a building you expected to be taller. I gave him the tour myself. We started at the bridge, which was smaller than coalition observers typically expected. Most species, when they build a command center, build it to communicate importance. High ceilings, central platforms, sight lines that say, this is where decisions are made and decisions are large. The threshold's bridge was a low-ceilinged, densely packed room where 7 people could work in complete coordination without raising their voices, and where every surface had at least 2 backup functions in case the primary was destroyed. Siveth asked if this was typical for human warships. I told him it was standard. He asked where the command throne was. I showed him my chair. It was bolted to the floor at a practical angle and had a cup holder on the right armrest, which I had personally requested during the last refit, and which the engineering team had installed with a small engraved label that read, Priority Infrastructure. Siveth's amber flickered. I was learning that his color shifts were a language, and that flickers meant he was processing something that did not fit his existing categories. We moved through the weapons bays. I showed him the mass driver assembly, which runs the full dorsal spine of the ship and takes 4 crew to operate at full efficiency, or 2 in an emergency, or 1 in the kind of emergency where you have already stopped thinking about efficiency. I showed him the close defense network, which is automated but supervised, because nothing on a human warship runs without a human in the loop somewhere who is empowered to change the decision if the situation changes. He asked about the tactical intelligence system, which computer ran combat decisions. I told him there was no tactical intelligence system. He stopped walking. I kept walking, he caught up. He said that every major fleet he had observed used automated decision architecture for combat operations, that the speeds involved made human reaction times inadequate, that this was considered a solved problem in coalition doctrine. I told him we had looked at automated decision architecture, that we had run the trials, that the systems were fast and accurate and very good at winning the fight they had been programmed to expect, and that the moment the fight became something the system had not been programmed for, it either froze or made a choice that was technically correct and practically catastrophic. He asked what we did instead. I showed him Chief Warrant Officer Addisa Mensa, who was at that moment lying on his back under a power conduit junction in Corridor 7, with his left hand inside an electrical panel, and his right hand holding a nutrient bar he was eating between tasks. He was whistling something tuneless and slightly off-key. I told Siveth that Addisa was responsible for real-time power rerouting during combat, that if a weapon system lost primary power, Addisa had authority to pull from anywhere on the ship to restore it, including life support in non-critical sections, and that he would make that call in approximately 4 seconds and be right about it almost every time. Siveth asked what happened the times he was wrong. I said we trained for that too. We came to the Damage Control Center, which is a room that other species militaries often do not have as a dedicated space, because the assumption is that significant damage means the engagement is already lost. The threshold had an entire deck given over to the question of what you do after you have been hit badly, staffed by 41 specialists whose only job was to keep the ship alive after the moment when most tactical calculations said it should have stopped being alive. Siveth stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. He asked how often the crew drilled for catastrophic damage scenarios. I told him 3 times a week for every crew member in a damage-adjacent role. He asked if that was frightening, to practice failure that consistently. I watched Lieutenant Priya Halford across the room, talking through a simulated hull breach scenario with two junior crew members, pointing at a diagram, laughing at something one of them said while continuing to point at the diagram with the other hand. I told him we found it clarifying. His amber went a shade deeper, not violet, something between the two, a color I did not have a word for. He asked one more question before we finished the tour, and he asked it carefully, like a person who is not sure they want the answer. He said the threshold moved like it expected to be hit, not like it was trying to avoid damage, like it had already accepted that damage was part of the plan. I said that was accurate. He said, and that doesn't frighten you. I looked back down the corridor. Addisa had come out from under the panel. He was standing now, finishing his nutrient bar, talking to a younger crew member about something that was making the younger crew member look like he was trying to memorize every word. Addisa caught my eye across the corridor and gave me a nod that meant nothing official and everything practical. We find it clarifying, I said. Siveth was quiet for the rest of the tour. When we reached the observation deck that evening, he stood at the port window and looked at the stars for a long time. The coalition escort ships were visible at our flanks, 6 vessels that were each larger than the threshold by a meaningful margin. Their formations were clean and precise and communicated, in the language of military posture, that they were serious and prepared. They were also, I knew, already half-hopping. They would not have to do anything. I did not say this to Siveth. He was already processing enough. He asked before he went to his quarters why the ship was named Threshold. I told him it was a traditional naval naming convention. Ships were named after concepts, after places, after things that mattered in ways that were hard to fully explain. He asked what threshold meant exactly. I told him it was the line between one place and another, the point you crossed when you decided to go forward instead of back, the moment that separated before from after. He looked at the ship around us. He said nothing. He did not need to. I went back to the bridge and looked at the star map and thought about the 43 systems on the coalition's list, and the 3 with no confirmed survivors, and the one question that nobody in that receiving room had thought to ask me, which was the question I had been asking myself since the moment I said one ship and meant it. Whether one was enough. I did not know the answer yet, but I knew how to find out. The Sen corridor is not a place you would choose to fight if you had any choice at all. It is a narrow navigational channel between 2 dense asteroid fields, barely wide enough for a formation of 4 ships to move in parallel, with sensor interference from the surrounding rock that makes long-range targeting unreliable and surprise attacks possible from angles that should not be possible. The coalition had lost it 3 times, each time for the same reason. A force would enter the corridor, the Volkai would apply pressure at the flanks, and the mathematics of the engagement would shift until withdrawal became the rational option. The threshold entered the Sen corridor at 11:40 hours, with the 6 coalition escort ships in a loose follow formation behind us. At 12:03 hours, Volkai ships appeared on our sensors. Owen called out the count as they resolved. 10, 18, 27. The count reached 34 before the sensor picture stabilized. 34 vessels of varying class arranged across the corridor in a pattern that was not an ambush exactly, but was the kind of formation that said we knew you were coming and we have already done the calculation, and the calculation says you will not enjoy the next hour. The coalition escort commander, a Selhari named Veth Kara, opened a channel immediately. He said the force was larger than projected and that a tactical reassessment was warranted. He said this in the measured, reasonable tones of a person who has learned that tactical reassessment is a phrase that does not feel like retreat. I told him to fall back behind us and kill his running lights. A brief silence on the channel. Then he did it. Good. I told Owen to open a general frequency to the Volkai formation. I told them we were the UNWS threshold, representing the human response to the coalition's request, and that we intended to move through the Seine corridor, and that our preference was to do this without an engagement. The Volkai response came in about 9 seconds, which is fast for a species that likes to run calculations before it speaks. They said the corridor was under hegemony jurisdiction as of 4 months prior, and that passage required clearance from hegemony central command. I said I had read their transit documentation, and that their jurisdictional claim was based on a doctrine of continuous occupation, which required 30 days of uncontested presence, and that the coalition had contested it twice in those 30 days, which made their documentation technically interesting but operationally irrelevant. Another silence, longer this time. Then they opened fire. I want to describe what happened next accurately, which means I have to resist the instinct to make it sound large. Combat does not feel large when you are inside it. It feels specific. It feels like a sequence of small decisions made at speed, each one dependent on the last, none of them heroic in the moment, all of them ordinary work done under pressure. The first volley took out 2 of our forward sensor arrays. Owen rerouted to secondary within 11 seconds, which was 4 seconds slower than his best drill time and 12 seconds faster than the coalition's standard protocol for the same task. Adisa, without being asked, pulled power from the starboard recreational bay and the secondary medical wing to keep our weapon response time inside acceptable limits. He informed me of this on the internal channel in the same tone he would use to tell me it was raining outside. We returned fire. The mass drivers found range on the 3rd adjustment. The Volkai lead formation broke pattern and spread, which told me something important. They had not expected us to find range that fast with degraded sensors. They had planned around a longer adjustment window. Their plan was already wrong. That mattered. The engagement ran for 22 minutes. I will not pretend I remember all of it with perfect clarity. I remember Owen's voice, steady and rapid, calling updated positions. I remember Halford from damage control telling me we had lost pressure in sections 7 through 9 and that she had it, which was the only thing she needed to say. I remember the crew working the way they always worked in drills, which is to say without theater and without hesitation, and with the particular focus of people who have practiced failure so many times that they know exactly what to do when it arrives. The hit that should have ended the engagement came at the 18-minute mark. A Volkai heavy cruiser had worked around our port flank while we were managing 2 engagements on the starboard side. It was a good maneuver. Clean. The kind of thing that works against a force that is trying to preserve itself, because a force that is trying to preserve itself will react to a flanking threat by addressing it, which opens the front, which the Volkai had planned to exploit. The hit took sections 7 through 9, breached the outer hull in 2 places, and started fires on decks 4 and 5. The Volkai formation began repositioning. They were moving to extraction angles. Their calculation said the engagement was over. They were doing the math. I told Owen to put us on an intercept course for the lead cruiser. I told weapons to prepare a full spread from the remaining starboard batteries. I told Adisa that I needed everything he had. He said, "You've got it." The threshold reoriented. Fired. The lead cruiser's shields failed on the 3rd impact. The ships on its flanks broke formation to cover it, which is what you do when your calculation suddenly has a new variable in it that was not supposed to be there. The variable was a ship that should have been done and was not done. The Volkai fleet went quiet on all communication frequencies. Not silent, quiet. The specific quiet of 34 ships all running the same recalculation at the same time and arriving at the same result. The result said, "We do not understand what is happening, and we need more information before we act." I told Owen to maintain position. I told weapons to hold. I sat back in my chair. Halford reported that the fires on 4 and 5 were out, that pressure in 7 through 9 was being restored, that she needed 4 hours and would have everything functional in 3. I told her to take the 4. Siveth had been on the observation deck for the entire engagement. He came to the bridge afterward. He stood at the edge of the room and looked at the screens and at the crew, who were already doing the recovery work with the same energy they had done the combat work. Not wound down, just redirected. He asked how many people we had lost. I told him 11. His color cycled to violet. He said, "You're not grieving." I looked at the screen. I looked at the Volkai fleet holding position in the corridor, 34 ships uncertain for the first time, possibly, in their operational history. "Yes, I am," I said. My voice did not change. He went back to the observation deck. I stayed on the bridge and did not look away from the screen for a long time. Owen, to his credit, said nothing. He understood that some silences are not empty. The Volkai envoy ship arrived at our position 14 hours after the corridor engagement. It was small, which was deliberate. A small ship with no weapons powered says, "I am here to understand, not to continue." It was the kind of signal that required, on their end, a significant recalculation of position, which meant someone in their command structure had enough authority to make that call and enough intelligence to know it was the right one. I gave them docking clearance. Siveth wanted to be present for the meeting. I told him he could observe from the adjacent room with a live feed but not be in the corridor itself. He asked why. I told him that the Volkai had come to speak to the thing that had confused them, and introducing a coalition representative immediately would give them something to calculate that was not us, and I wanted all of their attention to stay on us for as long as possible. He agreed. His color was a careful, considered amber. The Volkai commander who came off that ship was not what I expected, which is a thought I recognize as provincial the moment I have it. I had visual references for the Volkai. I had tactical assessments. I had the cold shape of what they had done to 43 systems. Expecting any single representative of a species to look like the sum of those things is the kind of error that costs you information you needed. What I saw was a figure that moved with the particular economy of something that has never in its life done anything unnecessary. Not tall by human standards. Dark and dense looking, like material that had been compressed over a long time into a form that was exactly as large as it needed to be and no larger. Eyes that were positioned to give a broader field of view than forward-facing eyes allow, which means they had evolved in an environment where threats came from multiple directions simultaneously. The posture was not aggressive. It was simply complete. Every part of the body exactly where it was supposed to be, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. There were 2 aides with the commander. They positioned themselves slightly behind and to the sides, not for protection, I thought, but for information gathering. The Volkai liked to know everything happening at the edges of a situation. The commander's name, translated, was a designation that meant something between 8th Operational Authority and Continuous Evaluation Engine, which said something about how the Volkai thought about leadership. Owen's official report listed the commander as Commander Vorsettel, which was a transliteration that Siveth later told me was technically incorrect, but functionally close enough. I met them in Corridor 12, which is a neutral space on the threshold. Not the bridge, not the command areas, a wide, functional passage with good lighting and nothing classified in visible range. I brought Owen and my tactical officer, Lieutenant Dean Farrow, who had been on duty for 31 hours, and showed it only in the particular sharpness of someone who has moved past tired into a clarity that tired people sometimes find. The commander looked at me for a long moment before speaking. I looked back. The Volkai translator device, a small unit worn at the throat, produced speech in a flat, even tone that I recognized as a deliberate choice. Flat tone provides no emotional data. The Volkai were here to gather information, not give it. The commander asked what class of warship the Threshold was. I said a general tactical warship of the 4th generation standard. I gave the specifications without embellishment. Hull length, weapon count, crew complement. The commander asked again, slightly differently. Not what are the specifications, but what is this kind of ship, taxonomically? Where does it sit in our deployment hierarchy? I said it was a standard response vessel. Another pause. The aides were very still. The commander asked how many ships of this class Earth currently operated. I told the truth. I gave the number. The translator rendered the commander's next sound as a processing delay marker, which is the Volkai equivalent of being asked a question you need a moment to sit with. The commander asked the question again in a different form. Not how many ships of this class, but how many ships of this capability level, accounting for all vessel types. I gave the truth again. The commander asked it a third time, phrased as, "What is the total number of human warships that could produce the engagement outcome we observed in the Sen corridor?" I gave the same answer as the first time. The pause after that one was the longest. Dean, beside me, had the expression of someone watching a person add a column of numbers 3 times because the answer keeps coming out the same and keeps not making sense. The commander said, and the translator worked to render this accurately, that the tactical data from the Sen corridor engagement was inconsistent with every prior data set the hegemony held on human military capability. That the engagement profile suggested either a ship significantly beyond standard classification or a crew operating at parameters that fell outside modeled expectations. I said it was the crew. The commander said that did not align with the hegemony's models. I said the hegemony's models were probably built on accurate data, that the data was accurate, that it just did not account for the variable they had not previously encountered. The commander asked what variable. I thought about how to say this in a way that was honest but not theatrical. I had one shot at this conversation. Theatrical answers are satisfying to give and useless for their actual purpose. I said that every species the hegemony had engaged operated under the same fundamental logic. That damage means cost. That cost means recalculation. That recalculation eventually means withdrawal. That this logic was rational, and that any military force built around rational actors will, over time, develop tactics that are excellent at exploiting that logic. The commander waited. I said that humans do not use that logic in the same way. Not because we are irrational, because we have, over a very long history of fighting things much larger and better equipped than ourselves, developed a different approach to the question of acceptable cost. We do not recalculate away from an engagement because the cost has risen. We recalculate toward the question of what can still be done given the current cost. The math stays live. The objective stays primary. The cost is a fact, not a signal to stop. The commander was quiet for a moment. Then, your ship should not have survived the Sen engagement statistically. I said I agreed. The commander asked how then. I said we do not accept the statistics. We work the problem until the statistics change. No bravado in my voice. I was describing a method, not making a claim. The commander and the 2 aides had a brief exchange in rapid Volkai, which the translator did not render. Not because it could not, I thought, but because the aides had lowered their voice below the device's threshold deliberately. Old reflex, private calculation. Then the commander asked a question that was smaller than the ones before it, and smaller in that way that important questions sometimes are. The commander asked if humanity was the dominant species in its home system. I said we were the only species in our home system. The commander asked this again, the same way they had asked the ship count question, as if the answer might change. I said the same thing again. The silence after that was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. The Sen corridor silence had been the silence of recalculation. This was the silence of understanding something that changed the shape of the question you had come here to ask. The Volkai commander looked at the corridor around us, at the crew moving in the middle distance, doing recovery work, doing maintenance, doing the 100 ordinary tasks that make a ship functional after the extraordinary ones that make it notable. They were not performing. They were not putting on a face for the visitors. They were just working. The commander looked at me. I looked back. The meeting lasted 40 minutes more. We covered transit rights, the status of the 6 contested systems, the coalition's stated objectives. The commander asked questions with the precision of someone who bills by the answer. I responded with the precision of someone who knows that every word I say here will be run through a calculation I cannot see. At the end, the commander stood to leave. And then, at the door of the corridor, turned back. "Why only one ship?" the commander asked. I said we sent what was needed. "You had more," the commander said. I said yes. "Then why?" I looked at Dean. He was watching me with the still expression of someone who knows the answer and is curious whether I will say it. I said that the galaxy needed to know what one ship could do, not because we were being generous with our resources, because the information had operational value for everyone in this conversation on both sides. The commander's translator rendered the commander's next statement as, "Understood." I was not sure it was. But they left, and 14 hours later the Volkai formation that had held the Sen corridor withdrew, not rooted, not scattered, withdrawn, orderly, purposeful, moving with the calm efficiency of a force that has updated its calculation and found a different direction. I watched them go on the sensor board. Owen said, "That's 6 systems, ma'am. They're pulling from all 6. I said I saw it. He asked if that was it then, if it was over. I did not answer immediately. I looked at the star map, at the part of it beyond the 6 recovered systems, beyond the Sen corridor, beyond the areas the coalition had identified and named and pointed to with their 412-page document. There was a lot of map left. I said, "Stand down from combat stations. Tell engineering they have 12 hours of quiet." Owen nodded and started the relay. I stayed on the bridge and looked at the map for a while longer. 11 names sat in my chest like stones, not heavy enough to stop me, heavy enough to stay. I did not write them in the report. Reports are read by people who were not there, and names in reports become data, and these names were not data. They were people who had done the work and paid the cost and trusted me with the fact of their cost, and the least I could do was carry it somewhere it would not be flattened into a number. I carried it the way I carried most things. Quietly, accurately, without ceremony. The coalition ceremony was held at the Ven orbital station 3 weeks later, which was a neutral choice that made everyone equally inconvenienced, which is the diplomatic way of saying fair. The main hall was large enough to fit the formal delegations of all 7 coalition species, plus their support staff, plus the observation gallery, where lower-ranked officials and journalists and historians stood in the back and watched the front of the room carefully. The ceiling was transparent, which was a Ven architectural preference, and through it you could see the star field, and somewhere in that star field, if you knew where to look, was the Sen corridor, which you could not see but could point toward. I knew where to look. I stood in the front row in my dress uniform, which I had not worn since a memorial 2 years prior, and which fit well enough to pass inspection and badly enough to remind me it had been 2 years since a memorial. Owen was 2 steps behind me. Dean was beside him. Councillor Adiz gave a speech. She spoke about the turning of a tide, about the difference between hope and certainty, about what it means to a people to learn that someone else will stand in a corridor and not move. She spoke well. She had the quality of a person who has thought about these words for a long time and chosen each one with care. The Thuresi delegation stood at the far right of the hall. Siveth was among them. He was cycling a slow, warm color I had not seen before, something in the gold range, which I had eventually learned from a translation guide was the Thuresi expression for something that does not have a single word equivalent in most languages. The closest approximation was the feeling of having been present for something that will still matter in 100 years. I watched him for a moment. He caught me watching and did not look away. His color held steady. He found me after the formal ceremony, before the reception began, which told me he had been watching for the moment when I would be briefly alone. He said that Siveth had spent 40 years in diplomacy, that he had been present for the resolution of 2 major conflicts, 3 border realignments, and 1 complete political restructuring of a species governing body. He said that none of those outcomes had arrived in the shape of one ship. I said most outcomes do not. He said he had been asking a question in his mind since the Sen corridor, and that he thought I would not answer it during the engagement, and then afterward I had not been available to ask, and then there had been the Voakai meeting, and then the withdrawal, and there had been no right moment until now. I told him to ask. He said, why only one? I had answered this question for the Voakai commander. The answer I had given was true. It was not the whole truth. I looked at Siveth. His gold range color was patient and steady. He was not asking for a tactical answer. He had been on that ship. He had watched the crew. He had stood in the damage control center and stared at Priya Halford laughing while running a catastrophic simulation. He knew the tactical answer was real but not complete. I said that Earth has done the math on what a full deployment looks like, not just for the enemy, for ourselves, for the coalition, for the shape of the relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy after the moment that the shooting stops. A full deployment wins a specific problem and creates a different one. It answers the question of the Voakai and raises the question of Earth. And the question of Earth, at full strength, fully deployed, fully visible, is a question that the coalition would spend the next 2 centuries trying to answer, and the answer would eventually make them afraid. One ship does not make anyone afraid. One ship makes everyone curious. Curiosity is a foundation, fear is a wall. Siveth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and the thing you mentioned, to the Voakai commander, about something coming after them. I had not known he had access to that conversation. Someone in his team had been thorough. I said it was not a specific intelligence assessment. It was a pattern observation. The galaxy is large, and the Voakai are not the first species to move in the way they moved. Something always comes after. Not the same enemy. Not the same shape of threat. Just the ongoing reality that nothing stays stable indefinitely, and that the ability to respond to instability is worth more than the temporary comfort of believing the current peace is final. He asked if I was afraid of what was coming. I looked at the ceiling, at the star field beyond it, at the corridor I could point toward but not see. 11 names. 1 ship. A log entry that said routine. I'm prepared for it, I said. That's better. The reception began. Someone pressed a glass of something into my hand. Music started, something with strings, pleasantly unobtrusive. The 7 species moved around the room doing the careful social mathematics of diplomatic events, making the connections that mattered and gracefully avoiding the ones that did not. Dean found me near the far wall. He was holding a small plate of food and eating with the focused efficiency of someone who had not had a real meal in longer than he should have. He said, "You know they're going to ask us for more." I said I knew. He said, "And the answer is going to be the same." I said probably. He ate for a moment. Then he said, "Think one's still enough." I thought about the star map, about the part beyond the 6 recovered systems, about the very specific silence of 34 Voakai ships all running the same calculation and arriving at a conclusion they had not been prepared for. About what happens to a calculation when you put a variable in it that the calculation was not built to handle. "Let's find out," I said. Dean nodded, ate another bite. Siveth, across the room, had found Counselor at ease. They were talking with the ease of 2 people who have known each other a long time and had been separately afraid and were now, for the moment, not. His color was still gold. The threshold was docked outside the station. I had checked the visual feed before coming in. She looked the same as she always did. Dark hull, no ceremony in her shape, no announcement. She did not need to announce anything. She had already said what she came to say. Owen sent me a message on my personal unit during the reception. It was brief. He said the dockmaster had filed the departure log for our next assignment, and that he thought I might want to see the mission classification that Admiral Akaffer's office had entered. I pulled up the log entry. Departure notation, UNWS threshold, assignment code, navigation clearance, crew manifest. Mission classification, routine. I put my unit away. Somewhere across the room, Dean laughed at something. Owen, who had just arrived at the reception, was already looking for the food table. The music with strings continued, pleasantly unobtrusive. I finished my drink. We had work to do.